Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. Hope everyone had a good holiday weekend they're coming off of. We had some travel. We're all back in town and getting back into the groove a little bit here as prospect camps are just a matter of days away from beginning here in Penn State. On our last episode of this podcast, we broke down a bunch of what we saw from early camps. This time, they're actually going to be coordinated by the Penn State Nittany Lions beginning this upcoming weekend. We'll be back over at Nittany Lions practice fields, getting a look at some of those future names to know. Some of them will surprise us. Some of them will be targets that we've discussed plenty, but it's a good time of the year going into June to really dive into our recruiting coverage at Lions247.com. We're not going to talk about much recruiting here on this episode of the podcast. Instead, we're going to look big picture at the class of 22, who really seems to be at the crux of Penn State's 2024 expectations on the football field. Daniel Gallen joins me now on the Lions247 Podcast. Daniel, this was a subject that you addressed a couple shows ago. I threw a question your way, 100 days out from kickoff at that point. Now we're at 94 days out from kickoff. Where was the signs of positivity? And you really went to this 2022 class and the talent that was brought in that year and the role they played in getting that team toward the Rose Bowl victory and 11 wins and the optimism for last year. Now, all of a sudden, they are no longer the new kids on the block. They are draft-eligible Penn State football players, and the dynamics have changed. For some, it's maybe a make-or-break feel to 2024. For others, we expect them to be high-quality starters. We wonder if they can move into national stardom. And, Daniel, there's a lot of directions we'll go in this conversation. We're also going to pick it up with Ace Baldwin officially announcing he is back with the Penn State basketball program, something we've anticipated for a long time. But the top player from the team is back. What are the ramifications for next season? We'll look at that a little bit later, but happy to get you on board coming off Memorial Day weekend and kind of get this group under the microscope from this class of 2022.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming off Memorial Day, it's all of a sudden you're almost going downhill into the summer now, and things are gonna start to happen quickly. I mean, less than 2 months away from Big Ten Media Days. We started that countdown, and we're down to 94 days today. On Wednesday the 29th. So it'll be here soon, but Memorial Day was nice, but there's something about coming out of that where, it's summer now, you kind of have it all kind of flattens out ahead of you of what's coming up.
Yeah, we have, I think, like 3 straight weekends, maybe 4 straight weekends with prospect camps going on. There's going to be some other prospect camps scattered among that. Penn State has consecutive weekends now here with official visitors. They've got a big one brewing this upcoming week. Tyler Calvaruso has done a lot of preview coverage at Lions247.com. Ahead of that, and we'll talk about that with Tyler later on another episode of the Lions247 Podcast. By the way, we have another wave of freshman arrivals coming through this weekend as the 2024 roster continues to get increasingly solidified. That will be a subject of conversation, as I said, on the next episode of the podcast. But Daniel, as I've teased a bunch here, let's get into it with that 2022 class. It was 25 scholarship signees who joined the program initially for this group. It was ranked by 24/7 Sports nationally at number 8 overall. Number 6 in the composite rankings was that class. And as I said, 10 burned red shirts. I mean, they had a huge presence on that 2022 team, a team that we didn't really know how good they'd be. They were coming off of a rough go of it in 2021, of course. And we weren't quite sure if they'd be able to pick themselves up and shake off that smell, or if it was going to be another rough go, and maybe we'd have some negative momentum to deal with for James Franklin. As it turned out, not only did 10 of these guys burn red shirts, but you had an All-American on defense, a freshman All-American on defense. You had 2 freshman All-American candidates in that backfield, that running back for Penn State, and a bunch of contributing players. And so this is a class that made their presence known early. And let's talk about maybe how that sets up for how we are viewing this 2024 roster now.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that stood out to me when I kind of brought that up is that when you sign a class and a class comes in that has this much hype around it, this much excitement, this many players, you start thinking really kind of, long term. But the way that colleges, I mean, these guys only have anywhere from 3 to 5 years. These guys won't be around for 6th or 7th, barring something unforeseen. And suddenly we're going into year 3 for a lot of these guys. And when you bring in 5-star caliber players like Penn State did, and some of those high 4-stars, some of the expectation is that they're only going to be around for 3 years if everything is going right. and suddenly we're in that year 3. These aren't young guys anymore. And so I think that you really kind of look deep into this class, the kind of roles that they're going to have this year, and what that could mean. But I think you look back to how early some of these guys contributed. You did have the ones who you were expecting to contribute. Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. I kind of knew that those guys would have roles, even though they were in a very crowded running back room, because that's the nature of the position, where running back, you have a short shelf life. If everything goes right, you're kind of in and out. But then you had someone like Drew Shelton, who got there in the summer, and we weren't necessarily expecting to see. And then down the stretch in 2022, he's your starting left tackle, burns his red shirt. And suddenly his career looks a little bit different. And so I think within this class you have guys who are taking a lot of different paths through their college careers, and kind of arriving at different places, and being able to put their stamp on Penn State in some different ways.
By early November of that 2022 campaign, those 10 red shirts had been burned. There wasn't any down to the wire dramatics about guys burning red shirts. Penn State was all in with a lot of these guys. And just to review that group of guys who made that transition from freshman directly to sophomore last year, and there was plenty of redshirt freshmen in this class, but 10 guys were not among them. Katron Allen and Nick Singleton at running back, Abdul Carter, linebacker that year, Denai Dennis Sutton and Zane Durant on the defensive line. Omari Evans played every game at wide receiver. KJ Winston at safety. Quarterback Drew Aller, who was the backup to Sean Clifford during that campaign. Cornerback Cam Miller was involved. And as you mentioned, more of a surprise and more of a necessity because of the depth chart situation in front of him was Drew Shelton, with Olu Fashanu missing the final chunk of the season. He stepped up and got those last 5 starts, including the Rose Bowl. So those were the 10 who burned red shirts. And not all of them fall into the same category now, though, in 2024. And we did our best to kind of divide this group into some different categories to tackle. I figured that the best one to start with first are guys who are not on the roster anymore, and just kind of cross them off the list. And Daniel, I think it's a pretty good number to have 21 of 25 signees on campus on year 3 in modern college football. I mean, I don't know about you, and as we'll go through, a lot of these guys are either contributors or we expect they may be contributors this year. There's a few that haven't done much yet, but this is a group where the hit rate has been impressive, and I think more importantly for Penn State, the developmental rate appears to be at a good place, because we're seeing guys invest in the program and vice versa in an era when every time there's a spring portal window or a December portal window coming up, you're wondering, is the staff going to send a message to get rid of a guy? Is the guy going to tire of the competition, tire of where he is on the depth chart? And yet here we are going into the summer, 21 of 25 players still in Penn State uniforms.
Yeah, I think that's really impressive. I think some of it, Penn State, James Franklin deserves a lot of credit for, fostering the culture, however much, whatever the communication is to, keep guys engaged, keep them, abreast of, where they stand, what they need to do, everything like that to, have them want to stick around, I think is big. Also, I think that there's some of the timing of this class. I know that NIL was legalized before they all signed, but when they all signed in December 2021, we didn't quite know what this was going to be, and that we didn't think it would morph into what it is now. So I think that having these guys kind of get in the door, a little bit before everything got really crazy, I think that helps a lot. But I was thinking back on this class too, and there wasn't too much movement in terms of commits and decommits either. I think there's only 1 or 2 that stand out in my mind, thinking back to that class. And so, I think that this was constructed very well. Especially keeping it together through a 7-6 season that was pretty ugly at times. I think that getting this group to campus and then keeping them here, I think is a really, really big achievement for James Franklin and Penn State. And I assume it hasn't been easy the whole time, but they've been able to do it.
All right, so the 4 guys who are no longer part of the equation: punter Alex Paqueta, he's now at Rice. Cornerback turned wide receiver Christian Driver, he's now in Minnesota. You're also going to find Ken Talley, a former defensive end here, very briefly here in the Big Ten at Michigan State. And then offensive lineman Malik McNeil, a big body guy. It didn't really come together for him here in year one. He's now down at Georgia State. And so those are the 4. And let's get to the other 21 now. And let's begin with the established starters category here. We'll begin with the guys who burst into those roles before anyone did in the class. And that's Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton. Neither one of them is considered the starter in this backfield. Neither one of them has been considered that guy since their freshman year, but they've been considered the co-starters. It's been a rotation for the most part. In fact, they both started for the first time ever in the Peach Bowl, the last time we got eyes on the Penn State Nittany Lions. And so we've kind of gone through the narrative a few times this offseason. Kaytron Allen has been Mr. Consistent throughout his career, despite the ups and downs, peaks and valleys that we've seen from the offense during the 26-game sample size of his career. He's really been right on the money in terms of average, right on the money in terms of what you're getting from him per carry, and from a pass blocking standpoint. We'd like to see more from a receiver role. I think that's something he'd like to do as well. And Nick Singleton took a step as a receiver last year, but maybe took a step back as a runner in a lot of that season until the final stretch. It was interesting. Following the dismissal of Mike Yurcich, he seemed to find his wheels again and find those lanes again. We'll find out what it looks like for Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, but I am more inclined to lean on what we saw from the end of the year from Nick Singleton, what we saw from the freshman year of Nick Singleton, than I am that 2-month sample size prior to the dismissal of Mike Yurcich, where we just wondered where that Nick Singleton was. And then I just don't really have any questions about Kaytron Allen. I think we're going to see the best version of both these guys in year 3. The one thing we've heard about them since they showed up to campus in January of 2022 is that they are serious workers and they're about their business. And I think that's going to lead both of them ultimately, if healthy, into the 2024 NFL draft. But if they can put it together and be that duo that we believe they could from the start last year, then they're right back into the national spotlight. I think that the glow a little bit waned on these guys last year, especially with Nick Singleton. I think he was kind of being viewed as maybe a dark horse Heisman level candidate. It didn't come together anywhere close to that for him as a sophomore. But let's face it, Daniel, if these two guys can get the job done with help from the offensive line, with help from a new coordinator, then it's going to make their classmate, someone we'll get to in a moment, Drew Aller, it's going to make things a lot more simplified for him because of what he can lean on in that ground game versus going into matchups and feeling like he's got to be the catalyst. I think he understands what he has in those running backs, and it's a matter of just making sure that they can get on track and there's not long gaps of that leave you wondering what's going on, as we saw at times last year.
I think when you look at those two guys, you're really interested to see what they look like with Andy Kotelnicki as the offensive coordinator. More so Singleton. I think Allen, we kind of know what he is, and I think that with how he performed as a freshman and then in year 2 last year, you have a lot of trust in him that you put him out there, you know what you're going to get. I think the fact that we've seen him really undergo a pretty significant physical transformation during his time here. He arrived at 225 and then his freshman year he's down to 201, and now he's back up I think in the high teens, maybe the low 20s, but it still worked. Like, he still looked good. He's still been consistent. I think that speaks a lot to him as a running back with his skill and talent. Singleton is the one that I think there's a lot of guys we're excited to see in Andy Kotelnicki's scheme. I think we're going to get to a couple of them a little later on when you talk about wide receivers. But I think that with Singleton and what Kotelnicki can do to really unlock him and put him in a position to make guys miss and to get out in space and use those physical skills, I think could be really, really big for Penn State. And I'm looking forward to seeing that. I think that what we saw down the stretch, I think that's kind of, I'm with you, that's kind of what I'm going to lean on a little bit more than what we saw in the earlier part of the season before Mike Yurcich's dismissal. And I think that with Singleton having a new offensive coordinator, finishing the year like that, I think he'll be in a really good position to maybe, capture a little bit more national attention like he did as a freshman.
And how frequently will we see these guys share the field together? Andy Kotelnicki's been really revered by folks for his ability to make sure that talent is sprinkled across the field by any means necessary. And you wonder with the lack of certainty and the lack of proven commodities at wide receiver, and without Theo Johnson at tight end, Will there be a little bit more of a desire to get those two on the field? We heard from both Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen, more so reading between their lines than directly, about the possibility of them lining up in the slot, lining up outside. And so you wonder, could you have one in the backfield, one engaged in more of a pass threat situation? And what does that force a defense to do? It'll be fun to follow how they utilize these two guys, combining for 4,200 scrimmage yards and more than 40 touchdowns through their first couple of years on campus. What's in store for Act 3 going to determine a lot what Penn State can accomplish on offense. And of course, so much of that conversation comes down to the quarterback, Drew Aller. You look at the surface statistics last year, and it's really hard to sneeze at them. 25 touchdowns, a few more on the ground, 2 interceptions on the season. When you poke holes and you start to apply the scrutiny, then you remember there were several starts in which I believe there were 4 starts in which Drew Aller failed to complete 50% of his passes. 3 of those resulted in losses for the Nittany Lions. We know that there's a lot of conversation brewing about the wide receiver room and how that is attached to this whole thing and what it means for Drew Aller going into his junior season. But it's all there for Drew Aller. I mean, he could put together a big game in West Virginia, keep it rolling through some of the clunkier opponents of Penn State's early schedule. And by the time we get into October, where all of a sudden the Big Ten spotlight steps up and these matchups get a little more serious in the national scheme, I mean, he could really work his way past a lot of what he experienced in 2023, put a lot of that in the rearview mirror for himself, for kind of the fan base, and for people who are, watching Drew Aller closely from a professional perspective and want to know what he's going to look like for NFL scouts. And I think we'll know pretty quickly, Daniel, where it is with Drew Aller. I mean, we're talking about a full offseason of work with Andy Kotelnicki. We're going to hear all the right things. How will we see Drew when it's time to step up and deliver passes downfield? Whether he has time, whether he doesn't have time, does he display the confidence not just of a former 5-star, former top quarterback recruit in the country, but of a guy who has now experienced what it's like to be quarterback 1 at a school like Penn State? He's been there at some really rough times, and he's been there through some really fun times now, and he's been the guy in the spotlight throughout. So what does he do when he shows up? I think it'll take us a few games to really wrap our heads around it. And if he's go for launch, he could be really go for launch, reestablishing himself as a premier quarterback within his own class. And we'll see about the draft class at large. But when we were discussing some of those early mock drafts, Daniel, I think a couple of weeks ago for the 2025 cycle, only 1 out of the 7 mainstream mock drafts that we took a look at featured Drew Aller in that projected top 32. Whereas I think if we had gone back last year and asked those same people to forecast things out, even before Aller had started a game, he would have been a pretty common, placement within those mock drafts. And so there's more film on him. There's more to poke holes on, but there's a huge opportunity. And let's remember that James Franklin didn't go out to Kansas and make this splashy hire just so it would look nice back in December of 2023. This was about setting the stage for a big year offensively and a showcase year for Drew Aller, which can not just be wonderful for him and his potential financial future, but for Penn State's ability to persuade and command the interest of elite quarterback talent like a Dia Bell, because they have proof that not only can they acquire that talent, but they can develop that talent and then get them to the other side as an NFL caliber prospect.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes it's a little hard to maybe overstate, how big this year is, in terms of Drew Aller, for a number of reasons. Because if Drew Aller comes in and plays like the 5-star that we rated him as and that we think he is, then he's probably not here next year, and that probably means Penn State has a great year and is in that playoff conversation, probably in the playoff. If Drew Aller doesn't necessarily have a good year, then Penn State probably isn't in the playoff. Probably, Drew would probably come back for another year, and then things look a lot different. Especially like you said, trying to spin it forward, especially recruiting. But I do think that this fall is going to be really interesting. I just pulled up the schedule, and I think that 3-game stretch of UCLA at home, then at USC, the bye week at Wisconsin, I think those 3 games are where we'll really know kind of what version of Drew Aller this is, if he has really improved from last year, because those are going to be some a little bit of spotlight games. That USC game will be in the spotlight. The UCLA game will have some national attention on it because it's pretty unique. I mean, UCLA and Illinois, who Penn State plays the week before, they might be on similar footing. But people have seen Penn State Illinois games in the Big Ten before. You haven't seen a Penn State UCLA game in the Big Ten before, so they'll have some extra eyeballs on it. And then USC will, and then at Wisconsin, that's a tough place to play. And last year some of Aller had the struggles on the road at Ohio State and didn't necessarily have the cleanest games at places like Illinois either. So I think you look at the month of October, and I think that's really what we'll learn, about Penn State. With the 12-team playoff, even if you stumble in October, you still have a chance in November to make it up, and you'll have to do that against Ohio State and Washington if that happens. But I think that once we get to October, that's when we'll find out. I mean, I know that the West Virginia game will probably have eyeballs on it too and be in a prominent broadcast window. But season openers, especially with a new offensive coordinator like Penn State will have, it's hard to take too much away from those, in my view, because
Daniel, don't you remember last year when Penn State receivers combined for 309 yards against West Virginia in the season opener? That wasn't indicative of you. And the first possession ended with a 72-yard touchdown pass from Drew Aller to Keandre Lambert-Smith. You didn't learn all you needed to know about what the offense was going to look like that night?
Season was over after that, and in my view, we knew what it was. And so that's exactly the point. So I think we'll get to October, and that's when we'll find out what Penn State has in Aller this year, and maybe where his arrow is pointing a little bit, and where the season's arrow is pointing. I mean, that's kind of the tough part. I mean, with quarterback, it's just such an important position that it's really hard to see Aller having an average season or not a good season, and Penn State, being in the playoff, being there. I think that he has to have a good season. He has to take that step forward for Penn State to kind of, get over that hump. And, and Penn State also in a 12-team playoff, they just they're not trying to just get in, and have like a game in Beaver Stadium in December. They want to be in, and then you want to win. Because that's like the whole point of this. So, I think that, Aller will have to step up for that to happen. And, how 2025 looks will depend a lot on what happens this fall.
Aller started last year just like putting up the stats that were like kind of dream scenarios for Penn State fans. He had threw for 325 yards, 3 touchdowns on 72% completion in the season opener against West Virginia. Week later, Delaware comes to town. Obviously, that's a cupcake opponent, but 22 of 26, 204 yards is an 85% completion clip there and a touchdown. Really clean performance. And then 5 of the next 10 games as the season, 5 of the next 9 games, I should say, as the season goes on. Not 10, I'm sorry. He ends up with a sub 50% completion rating. And, ultimately his quarterback coach, his play caller is fired. And I think, again, we have heard a lot of good things about Drew from his teammates, from the coaching staff, from Drew himself about where he is entering this. But there's going to be some unanswered questions quite literally until he faces an opposing defense and it is really forced to dial things up and take it to the air. And really, it's compelling because it's going to present so much about the narrative of what Penn State football will look like this year. We could spend a whole episode on Drew. I have zero doubt about that, but let's turn the page over to the new man at defensive end, formerly an All-American freshman linebacker and an All-Big Ten linebacker. That is Abdul Carter, and he's someone who we're qualifying as an established starter despite the fact that he has not started at this position. He is going to be a game wrecker. I think that coming out of spring ball, based on what we finally got a chance to see in the blue-white game, albeit against who it was against with the offensive line that Team White rolled out there, I am feeling more confident. I know people in that building are feeling more confident that this move that was ultimately triggered by Abdul Carter himself last winter is going to pay off in the form of quarterback pressures, a lot of number 11 getting into the backfield like he did at linebacker. And ultimately, he's going to be well positioned to cash in at a spot. I think Mark Brennan referenced this when we were going through some of the NFL draft contract stuff. There's a lot more money to be made and found right now in rookie deals and then long-term deals in the NFL via free agency when you are a standout edge rusher, versus a standout linebacker. It's the nature of the game. It's the way that stream is trending right now. That's just the way the current's going in terms of financial rewards. And so Abdul Carter has so much to gain from this season. And to me, Daniel, if it's something that doesn't take him until, game 6, game 7 to get in that groove, and he can be clicking from week 1, this has the makings to kind of give us the closest thing we may have experienced if Micah Parsons had been back for the 2020 campaign, when we thought he was going to be a lot more active getting after the passer.
Yeah, I think those comparisons have just been so hard to avoid since day one, when Abdul Carter got here and then got number 11. And then we kind of saw his freshman year, what he could do as a pass rusher. And you kind of start to project things forward a little bit. And, now we're finally here where you're going to have that number 11, rushing the passer more, playing more of an edge rusher role. I think that the feedback that we got at the end of the spring for Abdul Carter was really, I think, telling, especially given that it felt like that James Franklin was maybe slow playing it a little bit throughout the spring, in terms of emphasizing that it is a totally new position, that this is a big adjustment, even if you are as physically talented or skilled as Abdul Carter is. And so to finally kind of hear that at the end from coaches, teammates, that, yeah, like, this is working, we can see it. I think that that's pretty big. I'm just really interested to see what it looks like. I mean, you have a pretty crowded edge rusher room, and it was someone that you're gonna play opposite tonight, Dennis Sutton, who we'll get to soon. And I think that there's just a really big opportunity for Abdul Carter right here. And then I'm curious to see what Tom Allen does. If Tom Allen gets creative with him. I know that was really Manny Diaz's calling card. The creativity, moving guys around, using different packages. We've talked about how Tom Allen, when he was at Indiana, had to get a little creative to get the most out of the limited talent and limited depth that he had. So what does he do now that he's working with this Penn State, defensive line group, defensive group overall? How creative can he get? How does he move guys around? We've already seen that a little bit in the secondary with the line position. And so, Abdul Carter feels like one of those guys with his skills who could benefit from that.
We'll get right to Denida Sutton and Zane Durant, because this is a defensive line that those two really rose to prominence last year. Zane Durant, starting job. You saw a couple fifth-year seniors kind of working in and out of that starting spot next to him. It began with Akeem Beamon in 2023. Devon Ellis ended up taking control, and as we enter 2024, Beamon and Ellis opted in for their 6th year. But Durant's right there. He's not leaving that starting lineup, and he's somebody that continues to just physically progress at a really good rate. I mean, every single year it went from him looking pretty undersized, but having that tremendous athleticism and kind of that surprisingly brute force, despite the fact that he wasn't tipping the scales at 280 pounds initially. And now we get to the point where he's a 3rd-year player, and Zane Durant has spent a lot of time in Big Ten trenches. He's handled a lot of big roles, and while he's never had that breakout moment to kind of justify, I think, some of the early hype that had him pointed to as a major impact defensive tackle, I think it lines up well for him to be that kind of a player this year. I mean, he's up to 288 pounds, and he's carrying it very well. He's a 6'1" frame, so when you think about that weight on there, you might wonder what it looks like. I can tell you, it looks like just a gigantic middle linebacker still. I mean, he just looks like an oversized middle linebacker the way he carries this weight. And remember, he's a guy who got a bunch of carries the high school level, just a fun athlete. And I think right now, when you talk about him in one prism where the physical measurements don't wow you, but the experience is there, the production, I think, can really skyrocket this year. And then Dennis Sutton, who when you look at, you're like, wow, there's all the ceiling in the world because of this physicality and the frame. And I think he's listed 6'5". Sometimes we think he's 6'7", and he's put on significant weight, and he was the most active defensive end last year. You had Chop Robinson miss some games. You had Adiza Isaac getting veteran treatment at different points. And at the end of this thing, although he only started a couple games, no defensive end handled more game snaps than Dennis Sutton last year. So fine with putting him here as an established starter. That's where he'll be this year. Durant, Dennis Sutton, Abdul Carter, all your 3 guys, all going to be very important to this defensive line. When you examine those two that I just brought up to, though, who do you think has the biggest ceiling for stardom in their third year?
I mean, I think that's just kind of the product of your position. I mean, denied Dennis Sutton. I think that the ceiling is really really high. You brought up looking at those mock drafts earlier, and he was in those. He and Abdul Carter, I think were pretty common first round picks, given what, especially with Deny, what his pedigree was, what we've seen in his limited time, and kind of how you can project him forward. I think that his ceiling is there. Zane Durant, at defensive tackle, it's just it's kind of hard sometimes to put up those big kind of wow, eye-catching stats. If a defensive tackle has maybe 5 or 6 sacks, that's a really really good year. But I think that Zane Durant, for people who watch the team closely, who follow them, I mean, he's a really fun player to watch. He's someone who has really been able to make an impact over his first 2 years here, and I think that he can provide a template for Penn State, on the recruiting trail for looking for similar players. Because when he got here, it was kind of like, all right, you have this undersized. He was 6'1", 265 on signing day, I think, and it was kind of like, all right, we know he has these traits. How does that really translate? How is he going to hold up in the trenches at the Big Ten level? And he's really passed all those tests with flying colors. So we'll see, I guess, kind of how it looks going forward with him. But I think that he's someone who just is so quick inside, has power in that frame, and can just be really, really disruptive. I think that you look across the defensive line this year, and you talk about Abdul Carter, Deni Dennis Sutton, Zane Durant, and then either Devon Elise or Hakeem Beamon, and you think about Abdul Carter might command some double teams. Deni Dennis Sutton might command some double teams. You can see Zane Durant maybe taking up 2 guys inside, maybe even Beeman or Elise doing a similar thing. And you kind of start doing the math on, okay, who's going to end up getting those one-on-one opportunities to take advantage of. And, you like Zane Durant's chances on the inside against a center or a guard. And you like Deni Dennis Sutton's chances out on the edge one-on-one with a tackle.
Durant, by the way, got about 170 snaps as a true freshman, burning redshirt status. That doubled essentially last year as a sophomore, as he was in that starting role. And you saw that reflected in those disruptive statistics. He goes from 1 tackle for loss as a freshman to 5.5 tackles for loss as a sophomore, 2 sacks as a sophomore. I think that's an area. The ability to penetrate the pocket from the inside is where you really want to be able to hang your hat on with Durant. I think that's an area to watch, because if he can take off, I mean, he was kind of a pass rush specialist his first year on campus, kind of a gadget player in that regard, more balanced now. But that to me is one of those primary positives of his overall prospect profile, to be a defensive tackle who can consistently apply some pressure in the middle. That's easier said than done. We've seen a lot of good tackles come through here that maybe had certain big strong suits of their game that helped Penn State, but we haven't seen a ton of those explosive defensive tackles getting after the quarterback, getting sacks in bunches, and Durant could be that kind of a presence here as a junior. A couple more names to get to here in the established starter realm, and KJ Winston is certainly that now. He ended up taking one of those jobs at the safety spot and grabbing it by the horns last year. It was kind of a shared situation entering September. And by the time we got into October, it was very much obvious. It was Jalen Reed. It was KJ Winston as the starting safeties. And now KJ Winston in year 3, another guy who showed up on some of those early mock drafts. And we've been hearing it since he showed up to campus, really, back in 2022. This is somebody that teammates and coaches have felt have All-American potential. KJ Winston isn't the kind of guy who's going to tell us that himself, but these stages set. Year 3 working with Anthony Poindexter, burned his red shirt a couple of years ago, stepped up and really looked the part. And we've noted it a few times. This defense last year wasn't really built to, I guess, lift up a singular star from a statistical standpoint, from a snap distribution standpoint, really. But I think KJ Winston, when you review what he did last year, how sure of a tackler, one of the surest tacklers you'll find across the defensive secondary in college football, he's still got a really compelling physical presence with his length, with his quickness. And I think you put that all together, if it goes right for him this year, I hate to say it out loud because we've been wrong before, but maybe this is the first defensive back selected out of Penn State in the first round in an NFL draft.
Maybe finally. And I think with Winston too, the other thing you add with talking about him as a player is that, you know, I, if we make predictions for who the team captains might be, I think that he's someone who could definitely be in the mix for that. I think that he occupies a pretty significant leadership role. You know, the way that he carries himself, the way that he talks about his teammates and how he goes about his business and communicating, and as a veteran now, how he feels. The comfort in that kind of role, I think, is something that is pretty significant too. I mean, um, we talked about it before, where at the Peach Bowl, when they got down there and did a little introductory Zoom press conference, two guys we talked to were Tyler Warren and KJ Winston. After the game, the two guys they took to the podium after a loss were KJ Winston and Tyler Warren. We know that there's some intentionality that goes into some of these things. So I think that that's something that you're going to want to watch a little bit when it comes to KJ Winston in the future. But as a player, he's just really fun to watch. He's one of those guys who just kind of seems to be in the right place a lot of the times. I think that he was one of those guys who got burned in the Indiana game. But other than that, just a solid player, and I think that he is a really high ceiling. And some of these guys that have these high ceilings that we're talking about right now were not early enrollees, back in 2022. And so you make such a big deal about these guys are getting to campus early. They're, it's going to give them a jump start. But Penn State was able to identify some guys that were able to come in the summer, Abdul, Denai, Drew Shelton, and, get to the point where they could contribute immediately as freshmen. And I think that's something that these guys deserve some credit for too.
I got another summer enrollee from that class to get to here, and he's somebody who was the last addition to this class overall, as that February signing day came through from the West Coast all the way out in Washington, Venga Ioane. And he took a red shirt that first year on campus, and although he was physically prepared to take on what he may need to, I believe he played 3 games that year. James Franklin has been telling us since he recruited the kid, 350 pounds has never looked like this on a young man before. And with Venga Ioane, what's gone from this fascination about his physical makeup has really developed into him being one of the more consistent performers on the offensive line last year, called upon to a few different roles. If you look at last year's snap counts, only 3 offensive linemen played more than Venga Ioane during 2023. Hunter Norzad at center, Sal Wormley at guard, and then Olu Fashanu, the All-American at left tackle. He wasn't a guy who started nearly as often as J.B. Nelson, but Nelson had some health issues pop up last year. He missed a chunk early. He missed some time late, and that led to a lot of work for Venga Ioane, including essentially all the run at left guard in the Peach Bowl. And so I think that at this point, more so than Drew Shelton, because we're a little bit more removed. And last time we saw Drew Shelton starting at left tackle, it was a little bit of a struggle because he was coming up on surgery that he needed. So I am putting Venga Ioane out of the offensive lineman in this class in more of that established starter category right now, because I think everything we saw and heard this spring, regardless of what is going to happen across this line and the availability and this and that, he's not leaving the field much. Now, you could see a rotational approach where we see 3 guards in play like we did last year, and that means Venga Ioane might watch some possessions from the sidelines. But Ioane has been as billed physically, and I think where there's some excitement swelling now is this is an offensive line room that is, I don't want to say desperate, but requires an infusion of new voices, of new leadership after what they lost from last year's class. You had a 4th-year starter in Caden Wallace. A guy who's been around the block at different positions, has an Ivy League degree. He's your center at Hunter Norzad. And then you've got an All-American at Olu Fashanu. They're all gone. Those are some significant departures. And so we've heard that Venga Ioane has been somebody stepping up to the plate as a voice. And I think when he speaks, people listen. And that's an aspect of what he's going to bring to this offensive line room that's going to go beyond the surface a bit. So he's the last name that I've got on this established starters list. We can work our way through it. If you disagree with me, go for it. But I think we're on the money here.
Yeah, definitely. I think that Venga belongs in that category. I think that kind of like last year, even if he doesn't start, even if there's some sort of rotation, he's still going to play a lot of football. We know that he's done a little bit of work at center. he can be versatile on the interior. And the more pieces that Phil Trautwein has, the more Penn State is prepared to handle anything that gets thrown at it over the course of the season.
So here's the next category. We're just going to say guys that may be on the breakout bubble. It feels like they're going to have that opportunity. We expect them to have the opportunity, but they've got to actually deliver in these roles. And I want to go right to Drew Shelton, because we just finished with Venga, and I think it makes a lot of sense to segue here. Shelton last year played more than 300 snaps. He was the primary backup tackle at left tackle and right tackle after starting at left tackle the final 5 games of the 2025 year with Olu Fashanu's sideline. As we mentioned, he was banged up last year. He's a guy that it was a situation where you can play through it, but they want to get it cleaned up. And they got that done after the bowl. As a result, we didn't see Drew Shelton out there in the spring because of that injury issue. It's also a situation where how do you measure where Drew Shelton was at in that Peach Bowl when he got the entire start at left tackle, his first start of the year? And now you bring in Nolan Rucci, who has some experience in the left tackle. He was playing at right tackle for significant portions of the spring. But by the end of the spring, he was also cross-training back at left tackle, where he played for Wisconsin most extensively in their bowl game last January. And so now you get to a point where JB Nelson was spotted at left tackle. You've got Javen Williams getting a lot of work this spring. I can't imagine how helpful that was for the redshirt freshman, for the former 5-star who ended up being the primary left tackle in the blue-white game for Team White. And so things have changed a little bit since Drew Shelton last stepped off the football field. There's rising talent. There's some versatile talent. There's some new talent on the roster. And, of course, there's still Drew Shelton, who has a lot of fans in Lash Building and is a guy who has played a considerable amount of football for this squad the last couple of years. But he still has plenty to prove. And if he can't prove it for this team, then it's going to be open to maybe a rotation at left tackle, somebody else being at left tackle, or worst case scenario, where it's a year where they just can't quite figure out who their first left tackle is. And that could create issues after being able to rely upon an All-American presence at that spot the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I think that what happens at right tackle has an effect there too. That we've seen and heard really good things about Anthony Donka, which I think in December 29th, 2023, looking forward to the 2024 season, it was not something that was on our radar. And then suddenly on December 31st, 2023, it changed our outlook a little bit in terms of, guys who are competing for spots. And so, if that happens, where does Nolan Rucci go? Where does he compete? There's a lot of different pieces moving around right there. But I do think that for Drew Shelton, I think that it's good to get that cleaned up. Kind of a reset coming into a year after being kind of a spot player, coming in off the bench in the second half, subbing in for Caden Wallace and Olu Fashanu at different points. I know that going into last year, we thought that there was a chance to push at right tackle, but Caden Wallace, really leveled up last year, and that kind of eliminated that. So,
this time last year, or let's say going into spring ball, were you fully expecting to see at least a rotation between those two at right tackle?
No, definitely.
I did.
Yeah.
I mean, and there was 2 factors there. Caden Wallace stepped way up. I mean, he ends up a 3rd-round pick, right? He ends up in the top 70 in the NFL draft. And then I think something that we probably should have anticipated more, and then we heard from the staff later on, it's not easy switching sides, going from left to right and having to pick up those things and then beat out a guy who's started for 3 years at this position. And Drew Shelton had some moments where he was in the weeds, and it was a learning curve.
Yeah. And so you hope that, he's able to take these 2 years where it's such a, wildly varied experience, going from starting in the Rose Bowl at left tackle to, trying to switch sides, learn that, and trying to compete for time there. Hopefully that he can really package these together and really spin it forward. I think that he has the physical tools and everything, and he has a lot of reps that he's banked over these past couple of years. And so I think that he's someone who can has the chance to put it together. And if he comes in and is assertive and is able to really, take the bull by the horns, he can really change how this offensive line looks in 2024. But there's also young guys come in after you, where suddenly Javen Williams and Anthony Donka can change, how this looks. Nolan Rucci transfers in. JV Nelson can play multiple spots. So, the offensive line, I think that we've talked about it where you can kind of see all of the pieces, but we don't really know how the puzzle fits together yet and what that'll mean. And Drew Shelton is a pretty significant puzzle piece there.
I think there's some similarities in place because of their past experience and because of what's ahead of them because of some departures. And we'll go over to Cam Miller at cornerback, who got his feet wet as a freshman, burned redshirt, playing 120-ish snaps, just about tripled that snap count last year as a rotational piece of the cornerback situation where they lean heavily on the top three guys, Daquan Hardy, Johnny Dixon, Kalen King. As everyone knows, they're no longer with the program, and thus not only is Cam Miller due for a huge bump in snaps, and I know he got about 80 in the Peach Bowl, and people didn't necessarily love what the pass defense, including Cam Miller, accomplished on the field down there in Atlanta. But this is a guy who came into this offseason viewed as somebody who was a necessary rising leader because of what happened in that cornerback room. And everything we've heard has said he has lived up to that and then some. In fact, going so far as for Terry Smith, the cornerbacks coach here, 11th year cornerback coach with Penn State, to say that he hasn't had a leader like Cam Miller in his room in several years. Now, he's sent a lot of NFL guys in those several years, but I think that's a big thing to hear. For a while now, we've heard Cam Miller categorized as one of the most accountable figures in the Lasch football facility. Now he's going to need to be one of the more impactful defensive players if they want to maintain that pedigree at cornerback. This is someone that we've discussed on the perimeter. This is someone that we've discussed in that lion role a little bit, where you've also got another cornerback in A.J. Harris. You've got the safety, Jalen Reed, who's been the premier guy in that lion role through spring ball and going into the summer. There's a couple spots here for Cam Miller, and like Drew Shelton, where I see some parallels are, there's competition in the form of the transfers, A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber, and then there's competition in the form of younger players, Elliott Washington, Zion Tracy, John Mitchell, Antoine Belgrave Shorter. There's a lot of names in there, but I think that some fans, including based on some of the commentary I've read on the message board, have been way too quick to count out Cam Miller for a starting role or maybe a starring role. And I think that's a mistake because this is a guy who absolutely shined on the high school fields of Florida, playing a bunch of different spots, and really has done nothing to this point in his Penn State career to give those internally and really externally pause that his trajectory is not heading in the right direction. I know it wasn't a pretty situation in the Peach Bowl, but I'd encourage folks to focus forward a little bit with Cam Miller. And I think he's in line to really open some eyes and be a versatile piece. Remember, he's also a factor in the backfield on blitzes last year. You may look at him and not see that kind of a figure, but there's a physicality to his game where he is not going to be swayed away from playing close to the trenches as well.
Whenever Cam Miller gets to the NFL, whether that's after this year or after next year, he's going to come in and be, totally unfazed by anything that happens at the bottom of the roster in terms of competition. He's going to come out tested. I mean, you come in as a freshman and you're playing behind, Joey Porter Jr. And Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, Daquan Hardy. The next year, you have King, Dixon, Hardy in front of you again. You get a little more playing time, and then those guys leave and you have a chance to, and the things kind of open up a little bit. And then Jalen Kimber and AJ Harris come in, and then, Zion Tracy and Elliott Washington are in a position to compete for more time. I think that that's what Penn State does. And I think that they've gotten really good results out of keeping everything that, they love to call it the most competitive environment in college football. I think that Cam Miller is someone, when you look at his career trajectory and the rooms that he's been in, where that really, really shows. And I think that he's, battle tested. I think in terms of talking to him, he has the right mindset to deal with something like that, with how he approaches everything. And he's produced and at certain points when he's been on the field. You mentioned his ability to get in the backfield sometimes. He is not afraid to mix it up physically with opposing quarterbacks, running backs, take on a tight end or a tackle trying to block him off the edge. I think that there's a lot of really good things that we've seen out of him. And we haven't necessarily seen it for long, extended periods of time. And that's going to be something that is new about this team. I mean, no matter who the top three cornerbacks are, they're going to be guys that we haven't seen play long, extended periods of time, at Penn State. So, but I think that Cam Miller is someone who, can really be a breakout guy by the time we get to the all Big Ten teams at the end of the year, that he's someone that, we're talking about, okay, where could he be? Where does he stack up in this league?
One more name I had on this bubble conversation is Caden Saunders, and there are several wide receivers from this 22 class that are going to face increasing pressure to show what they can do at this level, or maybe move on after this season. And Caden Saunders, as a redshirt sophomore, you talk about the confidence being where it needs to be. I don't think it was where it needed to be at all when he first got here and he was working through that first year on campus. I think there were moments where he was turning a corner last year. Seems like he handled losing that punt return job pretty well. I guess when you see the guy go out there and do what he does, like Daquan Hardy, you can't really say, well, I'm better than him. What is going on here? Daquan Hardy earned himself an opportunity in the NFL, due in large part to what he was able to accomplish last year as a punt returner for half a season. But sticking at receiver in that conversation, in the slot, we know that Liam Clifford is going to be a factor there, but he's also going to be playing on the outside. We expected that Keandre Lambert-Smith was going to be a significant factor in the slot. Well, he might be, but it's going to be down in the SEC. And so now when you look at who's going to fill that role, I come back to Caden Saunders routinely. We'll get to Anthony Ivy in a second, and he's kind of in that slot conversation as well. But I think that as of now, based on how we feel and what we've heard about this wide receiver group, where there is certainly a lack of clarity, I think there's a real opportunity for Caden Saunders to actually enter this season and have possession of a significant offensive role. And then either he's going to wrap his arms around it, embrace it, and run forward with it, and we'll see where that takes him, or he's going to lose his grips on it. And I don't know if he's going to get a real full-fledged shot, barring an injury elsewhere, to get himself back in that kind of a position. So I think he's got, I don't want to call it a fleeting opportunity here, but he has a real moment where there's not really a lot of question about will there be eggs in his basket. There's going to be eggs in his basket from this offensive staff right now. What can he do with it on the road in Morgantown? What can he do with it through that non-conference action? Can he start to really establish himself as a player who, regardless of where he catches the football, whether it's a pass that's 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage or a slant pattern, beating a safety down the field, where he can do some things in space, where he can take a ball behind the line of scrimmage and turn it into a first down, or he can catch a 7-yard slant and he can turn it into a 40-yard gain. Those are the kind of highlight reel plays that he put together as a top 100 prospect. We've talked about the game speed, catching up to his real speed and doing less thinking. Seems like he's in a good spot. I think he was one of those kind of sneaky risers of the spring camp season where we didn't hear a ton about it, but he checked off a lot in terms of what he needed to do in that spring session with Marcus Higgins, with Andy Kotelnicki. And I am hesitant to put 2 feet on the bandwagon for any wide receiver being a breakout from this 2022 class right now. But if I'm putting all my money on one bet, and if I'm being forced to do it, Caden Saunders would be the direction I would go, because I think, maybe not a 50 reception guy, but somebody that, if given the opportunity, gets 2 to 3 touches even in a game, and he can get that with consistency. I think there's a chance where on a few of those occasions, he turns 2 to 3 touches into 70 plus yards. And those are momentum swinging plays. But as we're going to go over with this entire wide receiver class, we're basing a lot of this off of what has happened on the practice field and what has happened on high school fields. And we're starting to get pretty far out of the timeline where these guys have done damage on game days.
When we were talking about Nick Singleton earlier, and I mentioned him as someone who I'm excited to see with Andy Kotelnicki and someone who could really benefit from that scheme, I think that Caden Saunders is really the guy that your mind really jumps to, especially in terms of players we haven't seen do a lot or who aren't established, and who could take a leap in Kotelnicki's offense. I think Saunders stands out because of that skill set that he showed off in high school and that ability to be a slot and to do things in space. And like you said, get him the ball behind the line of scrimmage, maybe get it to him downfield where you can get a mismatch against a linebacker or a safety, depending on the formation. I just think that there's a lot that Andy Kotelnicki can do with Saunders. And I think Saunders is at the point where he is starting to put it together. That freshman year, we heard Taylor Stubblefield be very blunt about it. We heard Caden Saunders be really blunt about it. And so I think that last year really offered him the chance to find his footing. He got in there, got some run a couple times, got in the end zone for the first time in his career. And now he's at the point where he can really build off this and live up to that recruiting billing. I mean, he's someone who was a really important member of that class during the process. I remember that signing day. And we talk about the intentionality of everything. He was the last guy that Penn State introduced, the last guy that they brought on that signing day show to talk to James Franklin and introduce. I mean,
he was the first commit of that class in the depths of COVID.
Exactly. So he's someone who, Penn State has really, really, wanted and that they think really highly of. And, everyone's path is different. I remember last year, talking to Trey Wallace and kind of running through the wide receiver depth chart with him and talking about Saunders. And, he was it was a cliche to say that, everyone's path is different. And Wallace was saying that about pretty much everyone, but, it is true where not everyone comes in and is Parker Washington, like on starting from day one and catching a pass in literally every game you play in your career. Things take time, things move a little differently, but I think that Caden Saunders is at the point now where it sets up nicely for him to potentially establish himself.
His usage was just so hard to get a read on. I mean, and that was the common theme at the receiver spot all last year, wasn't it? But you think about that late touchdown catch, back in his hometown in Columbus against Ohio State. Okay, is Caden Saunders someone who's gonna be used more for this offense? He didn't run a route the next week against Indiana, and then he didn't surpass 10 snaps in the next couple matchups against Ohio State and Maryland. And so we only saw him reach 20 snaps once, and that was in a Michigan matchup in which the passing attack was essentially sidelined, it felt like. So we hope to see it from Caden Saunders. He's someone who's been on this podcast multiple times. We've had a lot of pretty candid conversations with him during his Penn State career. He has not really backed away from stating that it didn't get off to an ideal start for him here, but a former top 100 prospect in year 3 with an opportunity in front of him, it's right there for Caden Saunders to seize. The next kind of tier that we have here is we're going to call it more to the story. There's just a few guys here because we can't really call our shot for a breakout pick, and we can't really call these guys established starters. And a good example of that is Beau Pribula. Somebody who played plenty last year as their second quarterback, but unless Drew Aller is not available, we don't expect to see Beau Pribula in a starting quarterback role. With Pribula, the question has always been, how can you take advantage of what he can do on the field beyond the quarterback position? Last year we saw him be one of these teams' leading rushers. We saw him score a bunch on the ground. We saw him actually share the field with Drew Aller at times. And now you bring in Andy Kotelnicki, who has evidence, plenty of it on film, that he'll use different versions of quarterbacks with different skill sets to try to keep defenders on their toes. And he's also proven that if his quarterback is not available, he can redesign, he can kind of take a fresh look at the scheme based on the talent level at QB and start to come up with a different kind of a different approach that's going to be more realistic and more feasible with that quarterback versus the one who's not available. And so I'm not wishing availability issues on Drew Aller here, but I am wondering, is Andy Kotelnicki spending time daily figuring out exactly what Beau Pribula means for his offense? Because if this is somebody that they think can really cause some headaches for opponents one way or another, I would expect him to make sure that Beau Pribula pops up early and often in the game plan. There have been years where we've heard about a different quarterback emerging, and then we got to wait like 3 or 4 weeks sometimes before it happens. Last year we saw Beau Pribula involved, but I believe until late in the season, most of it was in garbage time. I don't think we saw Beau Pribula check in for the 4th possession of the game in the second quarter and take a bunch of snaps. So do we see that happen? I think that's a wild card here. In general, I think Beau Pribula is a wild card piece of the offensive roster.
Definitely. I think there's a couple things with Pribula. I mean, one of them is, where is he in his development as a passer? Even in that blue-white game, we didn't necessarily see him, chuck it around too much. He was still tucking and running, which in that environment where the quarterbacks aren't live, it's hard to get kind of a read on things there. And I think we kind of already know what he is at a runner at this point after last year. And so I think that that's something that you want to know with him. I think.
Daniel, can I take a moment real quick? Can I tell you what the starting lineup around Bo Prabula for Team Blue was? As you know, we want to see. Yeah. I'd love to see Bo Prabula get a real run at quarterback and throw the ball and kind of manage that. It was a very windy day. We'll mind that. But here's who was around Bo Prabula in that starting lineup for Team Blue. He had David Kensey, a walk-on who's since hit the transfer portal as the primary running back. He had Joey Schlafer, who's like, a developmental guy, redshirt freshman at tight end. He had Egan Boyer, who's under 270 pounds, I think, as his left tackle. He had Alex Birchmeyer at left guard, Dominic Rulli, a walk-on at center, Jim Fitzgerald, a walk-on at right guard, and Chimdi Ono at right tackle. His wide receivers were Tyler Johnson, Anthony Ivey, and Julian Fleming, none of which have played in a game with the Nittany Lions. So I just want to put that out there before we kind of do, try to compare one quarterback to the next quarterback. Drew Aller had essentially who was available to be the starting offensive line: Nick Singleton, Katron Allen. I think he had Cam Wallace too on Team White.
Oh yeah,
and he had all the other scholarship wide receivers, I think, except for like Carmelo Taylor, who's no longer with the team. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, but I think that even last year when Prabula came in the game, I mean, he threw 5 passes against Delaware, 4 against Maryland, and then every other game was 3 or fewer. Even against Ole Miss, he had the 48-yard touchdown pass to Nick Singleton, and that was a little bit off kind of a broken play a little bit where they just kind of found each other, and it worked out. So I want to see where he is, because if you put him in the game and if you want to use him as a change of pace guy, you don't want it to be automatic run every time he's in. And I think the other factor too is what is the commitment going to be to using that package with both Drew Aller and Bo Prabula? I mean, we heard so much about it and then didn't see it until the Maryland game, and we didn't see it against Ohio State. We didn't see it against Michigan. And then when we saw it against Ole Miss, it was almost a disaster. One of the plays that it was out there for. So what's your real commitment to that? If you're James Franklin, was that a James Franklin thing? Was that a Mike Yurcich thing last year in terms of not putting it out there? Is Andy Kotelnicki going to scheme some stuff up there, which we know that he can do based on what he did at Kansas? I think that that's kind of the other factor in terms of what kind of role Prabula can have. If it's something beyond just the mop-up guy in the fourth quarter. That's what I'm really curious to see, is what kind of commitment there is. I think we got to the point in October last year where it was kind of all right, believe it when we see it. When it comes to that 2 quarterback package, we were all kind of waiting to write an article about it until we actually saw it. And then, we saw it against Maryland. It was pretty interesting. But I think that if Penn State commits to that a little bit more, then the outlook maybe changes a little bit for Prabula.
Yeah, to this point, the most throws he's attempted in a single game is 5. That came against Delaware last year in week 2. In Big Ten action, the most he threw was 4 against Maryland, completed 1 of those passes for 6 yards. He did, we talked about the nice stat line that Drew Aller put together in his first year as starter. Here was the stat line for Bo in his first year as QB2 for Penn State: 10 total touchdowns, no turnovers. So a nice little thing to build off there. He was pretty protective of the football. But as we said, situations where Penn State leading by 25 or something in the fourth quarter for many of those opportunities. And we got to see the wheels a lot. What does the arm look like? We'll stay tuned on that one. Omari Evans is another that there's certainly more to the story. He burned his red shirt freshman year. He played every game freshman year. He was on the field in the fourth quarter during key moments against Purdue in his very first college game, a game that went down to the wire. And then last year came and missing initially because he was unavailable. And then when he became available, was not an impact player. Ran a bunch of routes sometimes. Sometimes he wasn't really involved at all. It was really sporadic usage. He was somebody that certainly seemed when that coaching change was made before Thanksgiving and Mike Yurcich was fired, and they wanted to simplify things and play to their players' strengths, which was really a message that we kept hearing. All of a sudden, Omari Evans was back in play, and as a deep ball threat, he had a big completion from Aller to Omari Evans in that Michigan State matchup on Black Friday. But this is somebody who have felt like was trending to be a real part of this offense last season, and was one of those next names up as we were getting past the Harrison Wallace and Keandre Lambert-Smith duo. And it ended up kind of feeling like a lost campaign for Omari Evans. And considering this guy's long distance player out of Texas, relatively short history at the receiver position, if people remember, he didn't play that a bunch in high school. And so you were wondering, is his future still here at Penn State? Is he still buying into this? Are they still buying into him? And they are. This is year 3. And so this to me feels like the stealthiest breakout pick someone could make out of some of the names we've mentioned. I'm not going to pick him as a stealthy breakout, but I had to put him in the more to the story category because he's played a bunch, but we just don't really know what he is as a wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, that freshman year, he showed great connection with Aller when they would get in the second halves of games, and he was on the field as kind of a tap guy when one of the top 3 guys needed to go out. He was one of the first guys in. And in the spring last year, I mean, he was the blue-white game MVP. We thought that he was going to be the number 3 wide receiver, with Keandre Lambert-Smith and Trey Wallace last year, and just wasn't the case. And I think that he's someone who has a lot to prove this year. I think that I remember talking to him after the Michigan State game out in Detroit. And he didn't offer too much about what the season was like and specifics in terms of being not part of the rotation and not on the field too much. But like you said, he seemed to acknowledge that they were playing to his strengths, which we know is that speed. And that showed off in that Michigan State game. So we'll see. I mean, we've talked so much about this 2022 wide receiver class over these past couple of years, but I think that he's someone too that maybe Andy Kotelnicki can unlock a couple things here, put him in a position, and they can roll.
One more name in the more to the story category, and that is Keon Wiley at linebacker. He's a guy that we certainly would have had probably on that breakout bubble conversation. However, he is expected to miss significant time from what we're told due to an unspecified injury that was suffered during spring ball. He's someone that through those early stages of spring ball and really coming out of winter conditioning, we were hearing great things about his opportunity on the 2 deep at linebacker as a redshirt sophomore out of Philadelphia. But unfortunately for Keon Wiley, that trajectory changes a bit because of an injury. We'll keep tabs on that, his availability coming into preseason camp and what it looks like for that linebacker room. But wanted to mention him as somebody who was on the ascension, but you got a medical issue to work your way through now. And so that changes things just a bit. There's 2 Lackawanna products in this class that we should just address in their own individual means. And I think JB Nelson is a name that we brought up a few times, so we'll start with him. He's played at guard. He's practiced at tackle. I think he's probably played at tackle too at different points of his Penn State career, but primarily at guard, which is where he started the majority of games on the 2023 schedule. As we said, Venga Ioane ended up playing a bunch there too. But left guard spot was JB Nelson's after Landon Tengwall was out for the season and ultimately medically retired. And so with Nelson, somebody who had tackle experience at Lackawanna, came to Penn State, has shown that he can be trusted as a guard / tackle kind of swing component. Venga Ioane, as we said, has established himself. He's a younger member of this offensive line. Sal Wormley is a 6th-year senior who came back for a reason at guard. So I do wonder if the reps are of the starting variety for JB Nelson this year, or if he is the 3rd guard in. And I also wonder how his presence and ability to play left tackle will factor in once Drew Shelton is now available, because the very first spring ball practice session that we witnessed was JB Nelson as the initial left tackle. But when spring ball came to a close and the blue-white game occurred, he was among a few linemen who were not available to participate in the matchup that day. And so it was Javen Williams getting a lot of run on the left side. This is one I guess you can kind of say a little bit of a mystery in terms of JB Nelson and his ultimate role, where we don't quite know where to peg him just yet. And it seems like that may be relying upon other moving pieces as well.
Yeah, JB Nelson, I think him getting banged up last year is kind of a bummer when you think about what we saw from him early. The clips of him.
The
Yeah.
feedback was incredible last August.
Yeah, and the clips of him from that West Virginia game, we saw that nastiness that everyone had talked about. We saw that on display. It's just kind of a tough spot, I think, for him. And Venga Ioane took advantage of those opportunities. So I do think that having someone like JB Nelson who can play guard and tackle, I think that gives you a little bit of flexibility, gives you some insurance, allows you to create some competition at different places, depending on how that position is shaking out. So I think that he's someone that who knows how much we'll see of him. I think we'll still see him a decent amount, especially through as they're competing in fall camp and everything. But I am curious to see kind of where does he stick. If he does stick at one of those two spots, and is he can he push for a rotation again at one of those spots? I think we'll wait and see.
And Tyrese Mills, another mystery out of that Lackawanna program. And we know that they've brought in some really strong players from that group. These two they brought in 2022. And Mills was somebody that we didn't really get the chance to see on the field at all that year because he had a week or two of practice at linebacker and then was sidelined for the rest of the 2022 year. The practices, everything. Didn't get back involved until 2023. And when he did get back involved, all of a sudden, well, he was at safety again, which is where he played during his time at Lackawanna, primarily where he played at Northeast High School in Philadelphia, although he was kind of all over the place, tended to be up toward the line of scrimmage. And what they loved about this guy from the get-go, Daniel, talking to the coaching staff a couple of years ago when they brought him in, was his ability to get downfield, make plays against the run, and really come crashing down in that support. And so you figured – yeah, linebacker might be where he lands. I don't know if they have it quite figured out, though, because we saw him playing again with the linebackers last year in Atlanta during some practices. And now I think maybe Tom Allen figured out where he belongs, the lion position. It's not quite a safety. It's not quite a linebacker. It's the lion. And that's where Tyrese Mills was, handling a bunch of his work in the spring game. So I think this is a good thing for Tyrese Mills, the kind of the evolution of the defense and where it's going, because it creates a hybrid role that really may fit his skill set better than one that existed here last year. And so I don't know what Tyrese Mills can make of this opportunity, because guys like Jalen Reed and AJ Harris and Cam Miller even are involved there. And Colin Dinkins, by the way, Khalil Dinkins' brother is another guy they like in that line role. But I think maybe it's something that he can cling to and grab to, because it just felt like for the couple of years he's been on campus, just haven't quite figured out his identity with the Penn State football program. Maybe he has, but we certainly haven't.
Yeah, when we started this segment, I pulled up the roster just to triple check what position he was listed at. Now he's still at linebacker, so we'll have to wait and see what the next roster update, because we saw him late last year. I think we saw him in garbage time in a couple of games late in the year, and then down in Atlanta, at linebacker. Then his position was changed to linebacker on the roster. Then we get to the blue-white game, and he's going through pregame drills with the safeties again. But this line position, it does feel very catered to him. When he got here as a linebacker, he was talked about as a Sam linebacker in that, Brent Price turned Manny Diaz scheme, someone that can play a little bit in space if necessary, do some coverage, do some run support. Stuff that we saw Curtis Jacobs do, pretty well over these past couple of years. So, I think Tyrese Mills, there's going to be competition there. But I think that he does have that skill set that can play there. And, it might be one of those things where if AJ Harris wins, an outside corner job, okay, that's one less person, in competition there. If Cam Miller wins the other outside job, that's one less person in competition there that you can rotate through. And we also know that football, really hard to get through a year completely healthy, all up and down the roster. So, I think having Tyrese Mills as a depth piece at something that's kind of new to everyone on the roster, I think that benefits him. Everyone's kind of operating from the same baseline in terms of that lion, and maybe he'll get an opportunity.
The next group we're going to finish off with are those who've yet to become a factor on game days. And it's not a really long list. Unfortunately for Marcus Higgins, the majority reside in his room, and he's got some stuff to figure out with this trio. Anthony Ivy, Tyler Johnson, and Mekhi Flowers. Mekhi Flowers, for a couple different reasons you can kind of put off to the side separately from Anthony Ivy and Tyler Johnson, one of which, unlike those other two, he did not spend the last 2 seasons at receiver. He spent the last 2 seasons at safety. And then the other of which is he spent this spring on the mend in recovery mode. So not fully available to go out there and really sink his teeth into his new role at wide receiver. Ivy working in the slot, Johnson working on the perimeter. They got a bunch of run with Team Blue in the blue-white game back in April. Again, I think both of these guys, Johnson, the perimeter is wide open. I mean, McLean is gone. Mega is gone. Fleming is new. Harrison Wallace is there. And I just feel like there's a lot of room. I talked about Peter Gonzalez having the door open. Well, Tyler Johnson's been on campus for a couple of years. I know he hasn't always been readily available to take advantage of that time on campus. But this is a huge year for him on that perimeter right now. I think because of what they do, they don't have much proven out there, especially guys who've done it here on this campus. So to me, if Tyler Johnson is not able to make a dent into that conversation and work his way into some September work, then real red flags go up for me. If we're getting through non-conference play and he's not engaged out there with the receiver plan in year 3, I'm not really sure what to make of that. Or if I do know what to make of it, it's not necessarily good for Tyler Johnson. And then Anthony Ivy, if you work your way past Liam Clifford and you work your way past Caden Saunders and what we expect them to do in the slot, he's really the next name I've come to, with a lot of curiosity toward that, big 33 MVP he was just named, Ty Sear Denmark coming in and what he might be able to do in the slot. So those 3 names, Flowers, Ivy, Johnson, any one of those guys stand out to you in terms of ready to take the next step? I know that's a lot to ask because none of them have seen a college snap yet.
I think Anthony Ivy is a little bit intriguing. Last year, we saw him move up a little bit in the order, going through practice during our practice windows. I think a couple times he might have been wearing his own jersey. I think he and Christian Driver, they near the end of the year, they were further up in line. A couple times they were wearing their own numbers. They weren't in scout team numbers. I think that's something that you can read into a little bit. So I think I'm a little bit intrigued with Ivy. He has the recruiting pedigree. He was a top 247 recruit. He's from Central Pennsylvania. There's decent competition there. Tyler Johnson, we knew was facing a little bit of a learning curve coming out of Magna Vista High School in really rural Virginia. He put up monster stats down there, but I think that there is definitely going to be a learning curve for him getting here. But I mean, physically, this spring, he looked pretty impressive. And so I think, like you said, I mean, there is opportunity on the outside there, with Megan McLean gone, there's chances for you. There's also a chance for you to contribute on special teams. These guys, we have barely played. And so maybe this is a new avenue that opens up to them and helps one way or another. But I guess it's a huge, we'll see with this group right here.
There's 5 names in this group, in this entire 2022 class. 5 out of the 21 scholarship players we're talking about are at that receiver spot in Omari Evans, Caden Saunders, Anthony Ivy, Tyler Johnson, and now Mekhi Flowers. And such an important piece of the talking points around Marcus Hagans this year will be this group. And then 2 more games to get to, one on offense, one on defense. Tight end Jerry Cross, who again finds himself, and the competition isn't going to get any less there in the tight end room. You do lose Theo Johnson, but now all of a sudden you've got this 5-star number 1 tight end prospect in America coming in, and Luke Reynolds. He arrived in January. Andrew Rapplier is a year older. He came in after Jerry Cross, but it appears, based on what we witnessed in spring ball, that he's going to be in a really good spot to compete with Khalil Dinkins for that number 2 tight end job with Tyler Warren. So I'm still seeing Jerry Cross probably trending as the number 4 tight end and probably having to battle Joey Schlafer and Luke Reynolds. And that's going to be a process. And it's a tough spot to be for a year 3 guy. And Jerry Cross didn't get to play a lot of ball as an upperclassman in Milwaukee, an injury, COVID. And so it's been a long time, Daniel, since Jerry Cross was out there playing significant minutes in a live football game. And I think that's got to be difficult. We're talking 5-6 years removed from those real last opportunities of sustained play. And I just think we don't really – I think to this point, if Jerry Cross is able to break through the tight end spot, it's going to be a hell of an individual story. Because right now it just doesn't look like that path is wide open for him in 2023. And I think, or 2024. And I guess I'll say the same thing about Caleb Artis. It's going to take some work at defensive tackle this year. I know he's got the size. He's one of the larger figures in that defensive line room, which has gotten larger over the years, generally speaking. But again, they had 2 fifth-year seniors opt in for 6 years. They've got a starter back in Zane Durant. They've got a recovering transfer player who they liked last year in Alonzo Ford back in the swing of things now. And then names like Keziah Izzard, in there as well. And so a couple guys here where I look at their positional surroundings and I wish them good luck. And you almost wonder, is it fair to say if it doesn't work out for them at Penn State that they weren't cut out for this level? Or maybe is it just fair to say that Penn State stacked these rooms and not everyone's going to survive and not everyone's going to rise to the top? And I'm not trying to forecast transfer portal eventually for these guys, but I think each of them, and Caleb Artis and Jerry Cross, for this particular year, face uphill battles to really break through because of what they're dealing with on those depth charts.
Yeah, it feels like there's a little bit of a squeeze happening to both of them. And I think that Jerry Cross has dealt with some tough circumstances, like you laid out, in terms of not having a season because of COVID, because of injuries. When he got here, he was nicked up as a true freshman when he was redshirting. So things haven't. And then on top of that, I mean, he's one of these tight ends that had to make a really big physical change when he got here and had to go from being one of those bigger wide receivers to being a kind of normal sized tight end, which also isn't necessarily a 100% hit rate there. That can be a little bit difficult. But and then behind, on top of that, like you mentioned, when you have Andrew Rappleyea and Luke Reynolds coming in behind you, you've got some. You don't have time to really waste or to be complacent, or anytime you're off the field, is more opportunities for these guys behind you. So I think Jerry Cross is in a tough spot. Physically out there. I mean, he looks the part in the room, and stacks up nicely. But we'll have to wait and see what he can do. I think a big thing for him will be being healthy, being out there and competing. With Caleb Artis, you didn't even mention the fact that they brought in 4 guys at his position as early enrollees, and so you combine having 4 freshmen come in behind you, and then 2 guys returning for 6 years in front of you. I mean, it almost just goes beyond Caleb Artis. I mean, Ty Blanding is in there too. Even someone like Keziah Izzard. I mean, I'm sure that things were forecasted for him to, be a guy, and then Beeman and Ellies are back. So it changes the equation there a little bit. Caleb Artis has been out there on special teams. I think he was on the field goal protection unit. So he's doing something there. He's using that frame. He still is the heaviest defensive tackle on the roster at 317 pounds. It would be interesting to see how Penn State would utilize that, because this past couple of years, outside of PJ Mustafer, they haven't really had that kind of body. I don't think on the inside, someone in the upper 3 teens or, in the 320s at some point. So, we'll see. That's another position too, though, where defensive line got to change your body a little bit. Might take a little while for the light to come on. Took till the 5th year for Devon Elise to have the light really come on, it felt like. We'll see with these guys, but I do think that it's just an example of how, when a program is recruiting like Penn State is, you can get squeezed a little bit, and the level of competition is always going to be really, really high.
And by the way, they've got another heck of a tight end class maybe brewing for the next cycle, and they're just going to keep bringing in talent at these spots. And I just wanted to backtrack really quick to Jerry Cross, because I went back and circled back. He had 13 touchdown receptions as a sophomore, which was really a big year for him to put him on the radar for a lot of folks. That was 2019, junior year. No games, COVID. They rule it out up in Wisconsin. No ball for him at King High School in Milwaukee. And then his senior year, he had 6 catches in 3 games. So again, we're going back to 2019 now, to the last time where Jerry Cross was really out there asserting himself as a guy. And it's just natural inclination to wonder, does he still think he's got it? Does he still know that he can be that guy here? When you look around the tight end room, it's a daily battle there. So just kind of an example there, as we worked our way through some guys that have started a bunch to guys that are still trying to sniff the field. There are a lot of different paths that we can take. And I also want to make this point. We don't have a lot of these guys figured out yet. Some of these players that we're talking about as guys who maybe are trending toward leaving the program eventually, or maybe aren't going to work out, we're going to be wrong about some of them. And we're going to be wrong about some of the guys that we have a lot of praise for right now. That's just the way it goes, because redshirt sophomores aren't finished products. Neither are juniors. And you're going to have 2, maybe 3 more years with some of these guys, 3 seasons to evaluate them at the college level. So their book is not closed by any means, but we figured it was a good time for a progress report, because this group is at the crux in so many ways of what this roster is going to be able to accomplish in 2024. Want to finish with a basketball note here, Daniel, and it's a significant one. Ace Baldwin officially back for the 2024-2025 campaign. Followed Coach Rhodes up from VCU last year, ended up looking the part as advertised, was the defensive player of the year in the Big Ten, was also an offensive catalyst for this team. And we saw his role evolve as the year went on, and as we saw Kanye Clary removed from the roster. What did you think about Ace Baldwin, how he finished 2023-24 season versus how he started it? And what does this announcement do for the Nittany Lions preparing for year 2 of the Rhodes era?
There's a conversation on the message board that I think we had it in the spring, and now we're having it again, where, how can the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year only be a third team selection? I think that in the past, I think we've seen guys win Defensive Player of the Year and not make one of the teams. But I think for Baldwin, it just comes down to he didn't have the consistency across the whole season. It was really during the latter part of Big Ten play, once Kanye Clary got hurt and then left the team, that we really saw Ace Baldwin kick into gear. So if he can do that for an entire season, he's not only going to be one of the best players in the in the Big Ten, he'll be one of the better players in the country. I think that he's just such a well-rounded college basketball player. He's been a defensive player of the year in 2 different conferences, the A10 and the Big Ten. He's a former Big Ten player of the year overall. And he's someone who can be in the mix to be a first-team All-Big Ten player. So I do think there is a little bit of an adjustment last year, moving up. There's a bit of an adjustment when it comes to team chemistry, putting together, building a team through the transfer portal, which Mike Rhodes did. And so I think that, this year there's still some retooling. Only 5 guys are coming back from last year. But I think that Penn State is in a good spot, and Ace Baldwin is too. I think getting Ace Baldwin back, which isn't necessarily a surprise. I think that we had heard, for the past couple of weeks, past couple of months, that he was most likely coming back. We just hadn't heard it from him himself. And so to get that on a Friday afternoon, it kind of, puts a bow on this offseason of player movement for Penn State. So, getting Ace back, I think is really, really big. I mean, he was their best player. It'll be his 2nd year in the system, or at Penn State, his 5th year in the system overall. Puff Johnson, Zach Hicks, DeMarco Dunn are also back. Nick Kern as well, who was another VCU transfer. You've got familiarity with those 5 guys. You got a 4-man freshman class. You got some potentially high impact transfers. It seems like things are a good mix right now. And I think that you put Ace Baldwin kind of at the top of that pyramid, as the leader, as the guy who can really, really have a significant impact. So I think this is huge for Penn State. It's going to be an uphill climb in the 18-team Big Ten. Our Isaac Trotter at 24 Sports National Desk did some power rankings, way too early power rankings. He had Penn State at 16th. And when I opened them up, he had UCLA at number 1, and I had a little bit of a disconnect where I was like, I was surprised to see UCLA there. So things are going to look different. But I think that having Ace Baldwin back is huge for Penn State and raises their ceiling a little bit this winter.
In his first year with Penn State and his 4th year under Coach Rhodes in that system. And by the way, he started every game for VCU in the preceding 3 years. Baldwin set career highs for minutes per game with 36, points per game with 14.2, assists per game with 6 of those, and steals per game with 2.7 of them on his debut Nittany Lions season. So we'll see how he builds off that. Plenty more coming on basketball when it's more appropriate on this podcast. But that's going to do it for the episode. Daniel, appreciate you joining me, breaking things down. I know you're going to record with our good friend Bud Elliott for a Cover 3 podcast. So that'll be dropping this summer as he gets his summer school series going and checks in with programs across the country. So good luck with that. We'll be trying to tune in for that one, and appreciate all the perspective on this 22 class and a lot more from you, Daniel.
Thanks for having me, Tyler.
Good stuff from Mr. Gallen. We'll come back with our second episode of the week later on, and we'll have a lot to talk about regarding the first major official visit weekend for the Nittany Lions from a recruiting perspective. We'll get our recruiting insider, Tyler Calvaruso, on with us to tell you the names you need to know and the potential ramifications of this weekend here in Happy Valley, when we'll also be back on Penn State practice fields to cover prospect camp action. Plus, another wave of freshmen arrives on campus this weekend. We're going to preview that with our second episode of the Lions247 podcast this week as well. For now, stepping aside, big thanks to Daniel Gallen. I am Tyler Donahue. We'll talk to you real soon right here on the Lions247 podcast.